So, one of my patrons tricked me into watching an isekai, and now I look like this. But you know what? I never thought I would say this, but I finally found an isekai that I actually kinda like. Despite initial hype, I'd say that the reception for Harold and the Purple Sweatshirt, Zenshu, has been lukewarm. When it was announced, I, like most people, fully expected it to be a real examination of the life of an overworked animator in an industry spread too thin, and it's entirely possible that someone did walk into a boardroom and say to the production committee, "Hey, will you give me quite a lot of money to make a show about how you personally are destroying my life?" But the sheer irony of that show being produced by Studio Mappa was so strong that it tore the very fabric of reality, and I got isekai'd into this world. But this is the reality we're living in now, and I'll be honest, I was straight up peeved when I found out that instead of a flawed industry's unflinching look in the mirror made by the studio that has become the symbol of the Japanese animation industry's broader problems with overworking and underpaying, this was just gonna be yet another in a long line of paint-by-numbers escapist power fantasies in a genre that was tired from the moment it was born. Just like ya boy, Sleepy to the Max, if you know what I'm saying. What a cop-out. And honestly, I didn't like it at first, but it's been growing on me. It's more real than I expected, and not just because it references a bunch of old stuff. Though I would be lying if I said this shot-for-shot recreation of this scene from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind didn't contribute significantly to my enjoyment. So I want to break down the animation and the details that are crammed in here, and in the process explain why I changed my mind about this show. This isn't an exhaustive list of every reference in the show or anything. We'd be here all day, and I'm sure that there are some that I would miss anyway, and I'm sure you'd point them out to me in the comments, but the show's devotion to the history of its industry is actually surprisingly important, almost to its own detriment. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Zenshu is an ode to animation and the labor that goes in. Okay, but if Look Back is a meditation on creativity and the paradoxical role it plays in our lives, Zenshu, directed by Mitsue Yamazaki, most well known as the director of Monthly Girls Nozaki-kun, but more recently a few episodes of Attack on Titan, and with a script by Kimiko Ueno, the writer behind the Dungeon Meshi adaptation, is more of an excuse to nerd out about classic anime and the actual concrete details of the production process, right down to the Mitsubishi 2B pencil that the character holds in her hand. And where Look Back director Kiyotaka Oshiyama leaves rough line work to create a subtle connection between the audience and the artists behind the screen, Mitsue Yamazaki just leaves the key animator's notes and spacing charts right on the screen. Asterisk, which we'll get to during the gripes and grievances portion of today's video. Feel free to consult the schedule printed on the back of the pamphlet you got when you walked in. But first, this video is sponsored by Aura. You may remember that in 2024, National Public Data, one of many so-called data brokers, who make money by selling personal information about people without their knowledge, which is totally legal by the way, they promise they'll be really responsible about it, had a data breach where hackers released 2.9 billion with a B records on people in the US, Canada, and the UK, making it the second biggest data breach in history, and the only one to likely include the social security numbers of every single person in the US, opening us all up to identity theft. I, for one, would like to keep my identity. I like it, and at this point, I've literally made it, like, my whole identity. That's why I use Aura. They keep me safe online by doing all the hard work for me. Not only does Aura protect you by scanning the dark web for any compromised information and monitoring your credit files for suspicious activity, a week after signing up, I got an email that they had contacted 21 of these data brokers on my behalf and gotten my info removed. I've also been getting way fewer spam texts recently. And if the worst does happen, Aura also provides up to $1 million in identity theft insurance per person. I get all this as well as a bunch of other features I didn't even have time to touch on in one app at one affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/swampjohn to try 2 weeks for free. That'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. Now back to it. In a way, it limits its own audience because it feels like it's an anime for anime directors. Even the name's short for or redo it all is an inside joke of sorts. In an interview with Animate Times, Yamazaki says she wanted to catch people's eyes with a phrase that makes people in the industry shiver. Natsuko Hirose is an up-and-coming animator and anime director. She fell in love with animation from the moment she saw A Tale of Perishing as a kid. She became obsessed with this movie and spent every waking moment drawing the characters, copying diagrams from art books, and later studying to become an animator herself. After achieving that goal, landing a job at the very same studio where her idol had made the the movie, and coming off the release of her first successful series, she's tasked with directing a feature film, a rom-com titled Hatsukoi, or First Love. The only problem being, she's never been in love with a person before. Her first love was A Tale of Perishing, and its protagonist, Luke Braveheart. People fell in love with her, but in her laser focus on drawing, she was completely oblivious. Already way behind schedule on the movie, Natsuko has become a zombie, shrouded in hair she refuses to cut, unable to finish or even start the storyboards, and unwilling to let somebody else do it. She's stuck in a cycle of kidnapping her coworkers to make them draw their own experiences of first love for her for reference, and Googling her own name to wallow in a confusing flood of praise and hatred. But her scrolling is interrupted by the news that a wombat is being sent to space. No, sorry. The news that the creator of A Tale of Perishing has died. Natsuko follows soon after, poisoned by some expired clams, and wakes up in the world of her favorite movie. The thing is though, as much as Natsuko loved it, A Tale of Perishing had been a huge failure for the studio, and kinda sucks. We come to find out that, as the name suggests, it's a real downer. Just tragedy after tragedy the whole way through, in addition to being full of plot holes and contrivances. Natsuko discovers that she somehow brought a peg bar with her from the real world. That's the thing you attach the paper to keep all the frames lined up. And the magical peg bar imbues her with the power to animate things into the physical world in front of her, rendered in this slightly embellished version of raw frames of key animation, with colored lines to denote shadows and highlights, scribbles for shading, and just a couple accents of color for personality. And in this absurdly over-the-top modernized version of a magical girl transformation animated by Keisuke Toyoda, and underscored with an angelic voice singing Zenshu instead of Sailor Moon, the peg bar pierces Natsuko's heart, transforming it into a stack of animation paper, which then becomes the main character for the rest of the sequence, as it flaps majestically like a set of angel wings. This sequence feels like it contains all the possibilities of animation and imagination in just 3 preposterously dense cuts, with every color you could possibly imagine, lighting from 3 different directions, what looks like 3 different layers of effects and sparkles, countless compositing effects, what looks like some sort of 3D particle simulation in the background, this psychedelic background art that seems to represent Natsuko's blood vessels, a bit where you can see what it took me several episodes to realize are Natsuko's actual blood vessels and skeleton through her body, and some birds, of course. And if you wanted to animate an object spinning really fast, there are 3 main embellishments at your disposal. You could add smear frames, you could add doubling effects, or if you wanted to get a little crazy with it, you could even have the object bend and stretch to really emphasize the inertia of the motion. Or you could do all 3 at the same time. Most of the main elements are animated on 2s, but there are so many layers, the timing of each offset from the rest, that it almost feels like this whole thing is animated on 1s, because there's practically no single frame where at least 1 layer doesn't change. It's really an assault to the senses that contrasts hilariously with the mundane action of actually sitting down at a desk and drawing. There's even a little Death Note reference thrown in there to poke fun at this contrast.
I'll take a potato chip and eat it.
And fully committing to the Sailor Moon bit, they repeat this stock animation in every episode, save for some slight changes like this one where she's not wearing any pants. In the first episode, Natsuko summons this recreation of this sequence from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which, fun fact, was one of the first big breakout roles for Hideaki Anno, animation legend and creator of the Evangelion franchise. Except this time he's got 2 laser beams instead of 1. It's also just really well done, especially this cut where the giant anticipates its laser blast, easing into this position and pausing for a second before this series of crisp impact frames start out resembling the previous frame pretty closely but progressively get more blown out as they go. Then afterward, the giant snaps into this second key pose, much closer to the camera with explosive force. The dark hatching in the shadows brings some dramatic contrast for this close-up, and I love these wild curving effects and the way they're composited so that they sort of invert the colors on everything underneath. These were animated by Satoshi Sakai, who also did most of the effects in the Magical Girl sequence. violence. Each episode progresses like this for a while. Some plot happens, then the baddies show up.
Are we the baddies?
And Natsuko saves the day with some crazy sakuga that usually references a classic of some kind like Gundam, Tiger Mask, or Gurren Lagann, and then falls asleep for 3 days, burnt out from the crunch of animating these sequences in a matter of seconds. It really does seem like a bland power fantasy at first. Natsuko knows the plot of this movie by heart, and when she first appears, this irritating little guy Yunio, a reference to Tezuka's Unico, is supposed to sacrifice himself to save humanity, plunging Luke Braveheart into one of several depressions. With her power, she's able to prevent that and many other plot points from happening, and gradually transforms this into a much happier story than it was meant to be, redoing everything, like the title suggests. But crucially, this is not escapism. Natsuko is a flawed character, convinced she has to do everything herself, and she brings that attitude into this world too. So when all her changes start having unforeseen consequences, and it feels like some force is pushing back against her revisions to the story, it becomes clear that her skills alone aren't enough. This isn't an escape from her life. It's an extension of it. Now, I don't want to oversell it. I'm not saying this is a masterpiece or anything. If you're looking for a moving character study in a classic fantasy setting, go watch Frieren again. And if you're looking for a fantasy adventure starring a socially oblivious nerd with a singular intense interest who would definitely watch the same movie over and over again if movies existed and also that movie was a documentary about monsters, go watch Dungeon Meshi again. Frankly, at first it felt very generic and boring, just waiting for the big action set piece at the end of each episode, and self-referential in the annoying way instead of the charming way. And it is a slow start. But after a few episodes, I did start to realize that there was more to it than I initially assumed. A Tale of Perishing isn't a great piece of art. It's dated and corny. One of the main characters is revealed to have a plot to destroy the world for reasons that are never really clear. The robot who can always sense the faceless bad guys coming just so happens to be recharging whenever they show up. And Zenshu is so committed to the imitation that it actually inherits the quirks and flaws from the stuff it imitates. Bland villains, cookie-cutter heroes, a damsel in distress who's only there to serve as another tragedy for the protagonist when she dies, even the repetition of that same stock transformation sequence every episode. That is, until Natsuko starts redoing things. I think the turning point for me was when Destiny Heartwarming, the lovely daughter of the mayor who is betrothed to the chairman only because he promised to build her an orphanage for the city, inspired by Natsuko, decides, actually, this is stupid. I'm already basically a princess, I'm just gonna build the orphanage myself. And also get unbelievably swole and start wearing a luchador mask all the time. Now that I can get behind. And the references also rise above the level of pastiche. When Natsuko animates a barrage of heat-seeking missiles in a chaotic frenzy swirling around a camera that swings wildly to follow the action, a type of shot dubbed Itano Circus, not only does it look a lot like this cut from Macross Plus, for example, they actually got Ichiro Itano to storyboard this sequence. However,
Chapter 3: Gripes and Grievances.
There are 3 places I really wish they had gone the extra mile. In ascending order of nitpickery. First, it really does shy away from the structural issues with the industry, instead focusing on personal failings that cause Natsuko to burn herself out. The studio president isn't portrayed as an angel or anything, but Natsuko's problems are definitely primarily internal. Like, what if her death was actually consequential instead of being completely random? What if she died from overwork, a heart attack or something, which is a big enough problem that there's a word for it? To be fair, a personal struggle is just more conducive to a good story than a struggle against external pressures that someone in Natsuko's position has little to no control over, and it's also just a different type of story with a different goal, which I guess is fine, but I just think the other goal is more interesting, I guess. Second, every once in a while we get to see some of the original movie, A Tale of Perishing, and they do this fun imitation of a 90s cell animation style with thicker lines, less detail, and even a subtle camera shake and blur that makes everything a little softer. Mitsue Yamazaki even requested 2 versions of the character designs from designer Yoshiteru Tsujino, one retro and one modern that still look like the same person. But I wish they had just done this for the whole show, minus the real-world bits. Harder to pull off and maybe off-putting to modern audiences, but man, wouldn't that have been cool. And finally, the asterisk returns for the ultimate nitpick. I mentioned at the start that Yamazaki leaves in the notes from the key animators. Well, that's not entirely true. The These scribbled notes and spacing charts communicate important information to the in-between animators and everyone else later in the production line, and they appear flashing around the screen as effects whenever Natsuko's creations appear and disappear. But of course I'm gonna pause the video and see what they say. Who do you think I am? This spacing chart seems to indicate that the hand of ultimate exister here should ease in with 2 in-between frames and a line of dialogue in the middle. But this one says that the camera should follow this piece of debris to the left, which it doesn't do, and here that exact same note pops up in the Nausicaa scene. As it turns out, there are a handful of stock notes used throughout the series, and maybe they were actually taken from some real keyframes at some point, but they're placed randomly and have no bearing on the actual scene they're placed in. I know only the most detail-obsessed vermin like me would really notice something like that, but hot dog, I would have smashed that like button and done a little Irish jig if they had been real. Mitsue Yamazaki, who decided to join the animation industry after seeing Cowboy Bebop and Urusei Yatsura 2, would stalk around the studio getting other female animators to show her their desks to use as reference for Natsuko's desk in the show. It's easy to be frustrated by this show, particularly when you take the context of the industry into account, but you also have to remember that it's not really made for you. Mitsue Yamazaki and Kimiko Ueno made it for themselves. It's for Natsuko. And that doesn't necessarily make it a great show, but you gotta at least respect it.
Chapter 5. The End.
Thanks so much to my lovely supporters on Patreon, who all have social security numbers comprised of a 90-character long string of wingdings, which is thus completely unstealable, even the ones who don't live in the US. Smackintosh, Scorpiante, Katie L, Retrohime, Serial Isle, Leia Pico, Nutaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Jun, Dr. Yola McSwag, Grav G, Squidgoo, Joe, Annie, and Sammy Z, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now.